Kia ora, I'm Nigel. I'm going to explore today going beyond sustainability and whether international education could become regenerative. But before I do that, you need to know a little bit about me. And here in Aotearoa, we have a wonderful way of introducing ourselves. So thanks to the kaumātua and kuia that helped me, I'm going to move through my pepeha as a way of doing that. Tēnā koutou, ngā mihi nui. Ki te atua, nā hoki tātou. I ora ai, I kore ai, I noho ai. Tēnā koe. Tuarua, haere mai toko tupuna mai. Yahu rātou me ingarangi ko te rana me Norway. Noho ana rātou ki Heratonga o Tautahi I Tamaki Makaurau. Tuatoru, ko Nigel Smith toko ingoa. Ko Owaraka toko monga, ko Mighty Foe toko awa, ko Hovding toko waka. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So what is regenerative education? Well, to answer that, we need to ask the question, what is regenerative practice? And just a caveat, I'm an inquirer, not an expert in this space. This talk is really an effort at exploring these issues and seeing whether they could apply to international education. Regenerative practice is an approach to strategic development that goes well beyond sustainability, and it's based on both principles and processes. And I'm going to talk to the principles first. So if we take a look at the planet and our progress over time, there's a number of components to the syndemic that people are speaking of that show that we're in a phase of degeneration. Whether that's climate change or biodiversity loss or pollution or a range of other components of this, obviously there's, for a number of years been a lot of concern about the direction of travel that we're on. And so the point that we're at now is some kind of a crisis point. It's, depending on who you talk to, important and urgent, or it's critical and we're actually past the crisis point. But there's a variety of ideas here. Now, the sustainable approach is really about mitigating that degenerative decline. And so there's a lot of efforts to try and level out, if you like, and get back to an approach where we might live sustainably and not have things get any worse. Now that's good, that's important, and by doing so we might avoid collapse. But regenerative practice is about really taking the idea of, well, hitting a sustainable approach from the point we're at now doesn't get us back to the point where our ecosystems and our societies are flourishing. And that's really what we should be aiming at. And so regenerative practice is about how should we and how can we do things about the way our organizations operate and the way our products and services operate that actually move our ecosystem back to a place of resilience. And we might hit a new balance where we're operating in a much more flourishing space. So where has this all come from? Well, it turns out there's a community of people who've been working in this space for a number of years, developing principles and processes that allow them to do their work in ways that make a material difference towards this regenerative goal. Just that they're not in education as far as I can tell. Last week I went along to an incredible meeting here in Tamaki Makaurau, around about 200 people in the room, all talking about the ways in which they've changed what they do to enable things to be regenerative, i.e. much better than sustainable. Now, there's town planners, project managers, construction people, community activists. I didn't meet another educator in the room. So let's take a look at what they're talking about. This diagram here is a really kind of classic in the regenerative practice space. And what you have is an understanding of our conventional approach on the left-hand side with a compliance-based understanding of minimum standards. And so you see this in all sorts of different industries, whether there are safety standards or pollution standards or energy use standards or whatever it might be. These kind of compliance-based approaches is sort of where we're heading, where we're at the moment. And that's really not doing much to arrest that degenerative decline. So there's a lot of focus on green or high performance objectives and strategic goals. And those tend to be around different sorts of specific technologies or changes that can be made. They're quite fragmented, i.e. they're not joined up, but they do make a difference and they do reduce the rate of decline. At the moment, there's a lot of talk about sustainability and the kind of holy grail that might be. And so associated with that is the idea of, getting to carbon net zero and there being a kind of, sustainable carrying capacity. And that's the kind of midpoint of the diagram. Now, that's great, but as you saw in the earlier one, that sort of freezes or arrests our decline, but it doesn't do anything to get us back to a place of flourishing. And so regenerative practice suggests that if we actually were more ambitious, we could move into a restorative space. And in that space, we're thinking about whole systems and how they interact with each other. And even more ambitious in the regenerative space, we're thinking about living systems, systems that can heal themselves, systems that have built into them and direction of travel towards flourishing and towards really good quality operation. And you'll notice that there's a shift from the conventional, where we've got quite a low efficiency of energy use, moving up through the phases to the regenerative, where there's very high efficiency of energy use. And that's a key feature of this understanding of regenerative practice. So one example of this regenerative approach in practice came from the construction industry. Windstone aggregates, a pretty extractive model. They dig stuff out of the ground and turn it into great products that build our infrastructure. They went through the process of a regenerative inquiry and a regenerative redevelopment of their Pukekawa quarry in the Waikato. And in order to figure out how to do better than just a kind of sustainable minimum, they engaged with the local community, with local iwi, with ecologists and hydrologists to understand how to return that space to a flourishing space that's even richer in life than it was before. And that process has taken shape in a long-term project to regenerate that space, and it's extremely exciting. So check it out if you want to find out how this might look in one example. So how would we start that in international education? Regenerative practice is, as I said, both processes and principles. And one of the approaches that is taken is a kind of a deep dive into the contexts and backgrounds of where we have come from as an organization, as individuals, in terms of our place, in terms of all of the perspectives that can be brought to bear on our understanding of where we've come from. There's a whakatoki that captures this, ka mua, ka muri, which is sometimes translated as walking backwards into the future. And it has that sense of if you really want to move forward well into the future, you need to look at the past and you need to look at where we've come from. And so there's a number of different dimensions of this, and I'll just briefly take you through those. As individuals, we've been gifted in Aotearoa this idea of introducing ourselves through pepeha. And the understanding of ourselves in Te Ao Māori is really informative and aligned with a regenerative practice approach. You could say it the other way around, actually, too, that regenerative practice is very aligned with Te Ao Māori. And that approach of understanding whakapapa, of understanding how you want to present yourself by connecting yourself with both the human lines of ancestry that you have and the key places that you identify with, is an important feature of what can be done, both for individuals and for organizations. We can look at the history of an organization and look at the records of what's known, where did it start, what were the ideas of the founders, where did they get their ideas from, and how has that developed through time. When we look at the places that we occupy, we can obviously look at what is known from records, and we can find out what has happened in that place. It's really important in that part of the discovery process to work with local iwi and find out what the story of the place is prior to European settlement, because our place in the world has been a place for much longer than our European culture has been here in Aotearoa. And it's been here, for longer than Māori culture has been in this place too. So we have layers that we need to work through. Once we go past the human layers of history, we start to need to talk to ecologists and geologists to understand what's the geology and the hydrology of a place, to really get the core of the story. And it's surprising how those features then come back to inform how humans have interacted with that landscape, and then how, the organization that you're part of, which is sitting in that space, has actually interacted with that long, long history. In international education, there's another aspect of the discovery process. I call that the edu story. What are the values that drive us as educators in our delivery of service? It's almost, what is the spiritual background of our mission, of our purpose, that shapes how we do things? And whether that takes you back to educational philosophers or those who talk about different kinds of pedagogy, or whether it's the inspiration from, different threads of the past, the Socratic method, constructive approaches. There might be all sorts of things that inform the way that you deliver it. That educational story or edu story is an important part of that discovery process. So the next stage of the process is looking at what resources we have. He kai ke aku ringa. The food is at our fingertips, or we have the resources close to hand. And in international education, people is number one. We have, teaching staff, operational staff, experts in pastoral care. We have networks of agents. We have sales teams, financial teams. And there's a huge resource there. And in between those people, there are all the relationships. And those relationships are an important source of capital as well. Then, of course, we can look at the physical resources that we have, the campuses, the hardware, the tools of the trade, such as it is. And then we move on to thinking about our intellectual resources, our curricular expertise, our business models and expertise in reaching across cultures. And of course, in our industry, we have a financial set of resources that's significant, and we're able to do things in our industry that other parts of the education sector may not be able to do. So having looked back and kind of looked at the ways in which we can examine where we've come from and what influences shape who we are and what we're doing in the world as educators offering our services to students and their families, and having looked at our resources and what we have and can bring to bear on the problem, then we can start to look forward. And I think there's an enormous amount of potential. And here in Aotearoa, there's a couple of things I want to highlight that I really think we should pay attention to. One of those is the tourism industry's Te Aki promise. It's incredible to see how the tourism industry has come together around this brand, Te Aki promise, and the idea of looking after and stewarding Aotearoa for the future. And there's something valuable in that we could look at aligning with. The second thing I want to highlight is actually the Treasury's Living Standards Framework. And this is a little bit controversial because it's on the kind of forward edge of where governments are operating. But internationally, this is seen as an incredibly forward-looking and progressive vision for how societies could develop. And the thing that's most amazing is that you've got the Living Standards Framework articulated in English with all of the different aspects that are so important to a well-rounded society and having a high aspiration for flourishing. But that has been developed in conjunction with a framework from Te Ao Māori, Te Ara Waiora. And you can see that starting from Wairua, from spirit, moving out to Taio, the environment, and then the different sources of mana for people, and the flourishing that is modelled there in that space. And talking with people from that part of government, they use both of these frameworks equally in working out how to set policy. And that's actually something that I think we should be emphasising in international education. Internationally, there's also the B Corp movement, and the B Corp accreditation is something that famous brands like Patagonia have been getting involved with. It's just a way of assuring that your enterprise is sustainable and looks at all of the different holistic dimensions. This is something that international education could also take a look at. So some possible directions from here. I'd start with those regen processes. Owning who we are, owning our story, figuring out what are the dynamics that make us who we are, and doing that in a really deep way. Eco story, edu story, looking at whakapapa, looking at the way that we might present ourselves through pepeha and our understanding of the layers of history, both European and Māori. Once we have established that, we can move forward very clearly and confidently with something that is uniquely Aotearoa, and it speaks uniquely to the aspiration that we might be making a positive difference to the world. So that process approach is the place to start, but if we were to look at the regen principles, there's a couple of ideas to throw into the mix, just emphasizing that you want to start with the processes first. In our industry, aviation is really central. And it would make sense to me for us to be looking at the incredible work that's happening in sustainable aviation, whether that's airlines doing work for their own innovation, or whether it's research going into different kinds of biofuel or different kinds of technology that support sustainable aviation. It seems like there's room there for us to align and get involved and support those efforts. The other area is, of course, could we renovate the curricula that we deliver so that they've got regenerative principles built into them? And in so doing, we transform a whole generation of scholars with the ideas that are going to go out and be seeded and take that state of the world from a sort of a flat line sustainability to that flourishing line back up to the new resilient balance. So those are just a few ideas as I've been exploring regenerative practice and what it might look like to move towards a regenerative international education. If you have any questions or you'd love to just have a coffee, contact me and we can talk further. Details are on the screen. Thank you for watching, and let's move forward towards a regenerative international education together.